When three armed men burst into the emergency room demanding drugs, everyone assumed the quiet black nurse would be the easiest target. They had no idea that Danielle Carter spent 8 years as a Navy SEAL before becoming a trauma nurse. What happened in the next 4 minutes changed everything. Danielle Carter had worked at Chicago Memorial Hospital's emergency room for 2 years, and most of his colleagues still didn't know anything real about him. At 34 years old, he was one of the best trauma nurses on the night shift, efficient, calm under pressure, with steady hands and a gift for making scared patients feel safe. He arrived exactly on time for every shift, did his work with quiet competence, and went home without fanfare. He didn't talk much about his past. When people asked, he'd say he'd worked various jobs before nursing school. Nothing special. He certainly never mentioned the 8 years he'd spent as a Navy SEAL, the 3 combat deployments, or the medals sitting in a box in his closet. Daniel was tall and fit, but he carried himself with a kind of stillness that some people mistook for passivity. He spoke softly. He never raised his voice, even when things got chaotic. He never argued back when doctors snapped at him, or when other staff members made careless assumptions. The assumptions came frequently. Dr. Starr, Monica Harper, was the worst. She was a talented surgeon, brilliant and quick, but she decided on day 1 that Daniel was somehow less competent than the other nurses. She questioned his judgment calls in front of patients. She double-checked his work publicly. She talked to him like he was slow to understand. "Try to keep up, Carter," she'd say, her tone dripping with condescension. "Some of us actually went to medical school." Daniel never responded. He'd just nod, say, "Yes, doctor," and continue doing his job at a level of excellence that spoke for itself. To everyone except those who'd already decided not to see it. He'd learned a long time ago that some people would always make assumptions. The uniform he used to wear had taught him that proving yourself to skeptics was a waste of energy. You just did the work. You showed up. You served firing. Even if no one noticed, the work still mattered. It was a Friday night, which meant the ER was a controlled chaos of injuries, overdoses, and medical emergencies. Daniel moved between patients with practiced efficiency, starting an IV here, prepping a trauma bay there, talking a scared teenager through a panic attack while simultaneously monitoring an elderly man's dropping blood pressure. He was in the middle of treating a 7-year-old girl who'd been in a car accident when Dr. Harper swept into the room. "What's her status?" Harper demanded, not looking at Daniel. "Possible internal bleeding, BP dropping. I've got 2 lines in and I'm pushing fluids," Daniel said calmly, his hands never stopping their work. "CT is ready for her." Harper glanced at the monitors, then at Daniel's IV placement. "You used a 22 gauge. She needed an 18. With respect, doctor, her veins are small and fragile. The 22 was the right call. She's getting adequate fluid resuscitation." Harper's jaw tightened. "I'll be the judge of that. Next time, wait for me before making decisions above your pay grade." 2 other nurses in the room exchanged uncomfortable glances but said nothing. Daniel just nodded and continued preparing the child for transport. "You're safe, sweetheart," he told the girl gently, his voice completely different from the professional tone he'd used with Harper. "I'm going to be right here with you the whole way, okay?" The girl nodded, tears on her cheeks, and grabbed his hand. As they wheeled her toward CT, Daniel caught one of the other nurses watching him with something like sympathy. He gave her a small smile that said he was fine. He'd faced down threats a lot more serious than an arrogant surgeon, though none of his colleagues knew that. Not yet. At 2:47 a.m., the ER had finally quieted down. Most of the critical patients had been admitted or discharged. A few people sat in the waiting room. The overnight skeleton crew was catching up on charting. Daniel was at the nurse's station, updating the 7-year-old girl's chart. She was stable now, sleeping peacefully upstairs, when the automatic doors exploded open. 3 men burst through, their faces covered with bandanas, guns drawn and waving wildly. "Everybody down. Get down now." The lead gunman, tall, twitchy, clearly high on something, fired a shot into the ceiling. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Ceiling tiles rained down. Staff members screamed. Patients in the waiting room dove behind chairs. Dr. Harper, who'd been at the coffee station, dropped her cup and hit the floor immediately. Her hands over her head. Daniel's body reacted before his conscious mind engaged. Every sense sharpened. His breathing slowed. His heart rate, paradoxically, dropped rather than spiked. His brain began processing information at the speed he'd been trained for. 3 hostiles, all armed, 1 with a shotgun, 2 with handguns, erratic movements, suggesting drugs, no clear tactical training, high probability of panicked violence. He remained standing for half a second longer than everyone else, his hands slowly rising to a non-threatening position, visible and empty-eyed. "You, nurse, get on the ground!" The second gunman shouted at Daniel. Daniel complied, moving, slowly and deliberately, keeping his hands visible. But his eyes never stopped tracking. He noted the positions of all 3 men, the angles of the weapons, the distances between them, the locations of cover, the exits, the positions of staff and patients, old habits, old training still there, just beneath the surface of the quiet nurse who never talked about his past. "Where's the medication room?" the lead gunman shouted, pressing his shotgun against a young nurse's head. "Open it now or people start dying." The young nurse, Jessica, barely 25 years old, was sobbing, her hands shaking so badly she couldn't get her keys out of her pocket. I can't, she stammered. The lead gunman pressed the barrel harder against her temple. "Open it." From his position on the floor, Daniel assessed the deteriorating situation. The 3 gunmen were spreading out now. One was forcing staff members toward the medication room. Another was threatening patients in the waiting area. The third was growing more agitated by the second, his gun sweeping wildly across everyone on the ground. Security had been locked out. He could hear them shouting from behind the sealed emergency doors. Police would have been called, but response time was at least 4 to 6 minutes. Maybe longer on a Friday night. The lead gunman noticed a shadow of movement near the floor. "You, big guy," I said, "don't move." Daniel had been slowly adjusting his position, minimally, imperceptibly to anyone without tactical training. He froze. Slowly, Daniel rose to his feet, hands still visible, posture non-threatening but balanced. Years of close-quarters combat training had taught him how to appear compliant while remaining coiled and ready. "Get over here. Open this door." As Daniel moved forward, the third gunman swung his weapon toward the waiting room, toward an elderly man trying to help his wife to the floor. "Everybody stays down." Then Daniel heard it, a small, terrified whimper from behind the admit desk. The 7-year-old girl he'd just treated. She must have come downstairs looking for her parents. She was hiding behind the desk, shaking with fear. And the second gunman had just noticed her. "Well, what do we have here?" He moved toward the child, his gun pointed down at her hiding spot. That's when Danielle Carter stopped being a nurse and became something else entirely. "We got a kid here," the second gunman called out, grabbing the 7-year-old by her arm and dragging her out from behind the desk. She screamed, a sound of pure terror that cut through the room. Daniel's pulse, which had remained eerily steady throughout the entire encounter, finally responded, but not with panic, with absolute clarity. The gunman pressed his weapon to the child's head. "Open the medication room right now or I paint the walls with this kid's brain." Staff members were crying, frozen in horror. Dr. Harper had her eyes squeezed shut, praying. Security was still locked out. The police weren't here yet. And a 7-year-old girl, a patient Daniel had personally treated, had promised would be safe, was about to die. Daniel's body made the decision before his conscious mind could weigh the risks. He took one step forward, hands still visible but his posture subtly shifting. When he spoke, his voice was completely different. Not the gentle nurse voice, not even the professional nurse voice. It was the voice of a man who'd commanded special operations teams in the worst combat zones on Earth. Low, calm, and carrying absolute authority. "Put the weapon down." The lead gunman swung toward him. "What did you say?" I said, "Put the weapon down." Daniel's voice didn't rise, but it cut through the chaos like a blade. "You don't want to hurt Ty, Hatchild. You came for drugs, not murder charges. Lower your weapon and we can all walk away from this." For a moment, the room was suspended in absolute silence. Everyone, staff, patients, even the other two gunmen, was staring at Daniel. The transformation was visible. The quiet, unassuming nurse was gone. In his place stood someone who moved with predatory confidence, whose eyes tracked every person and weapon with tactical precision, whose very presence radiated controlled violence. The lead gunman's drug-addled brain struggled to process the shift. "Who the hell do you think you are?" "Someone who's asking you nicely," Daniel said. Once. The gunman's finger tightened on the trigger. Daniel moved. What happened next took approximately 4 seconds, though later everyone would describe it differently. Some said it happened so fast they didn't see anything. Others said it looked choreographed like a movie. All agreed on one thing. They'd never seen anything like it. Daniel closed the 15 feet between himself and the lead gunman in less than 2 seconds. His movement was so explosive, so unexpected, that by the time the gunman tried to swing the shotgun toward him, Daniel was already inside his reach. One hand trapped the barrel, redirecting it away from anyone in the line of fire. The other hand struck the gunman's wrist with surgical precision, causing an involuntary muscle response that released the weapon. Before the shotgun even hit the ground, Daniel had spun the gunman around, dropping him with a controlled takedown that left him face down on the floor, arm locked behind his back in a position that made resistance impossible. The second gunman, the one holding the child, started to react, started to bring his weapon to bear. Daniel released the first gunman, who was groaning and no longer a threat, and moved toward the second. But this time he couldn't be as aggressive. The child was too close. "Let her go," Daniel said, his voice still carrying that command presence. He was approaching at an angle, positioning himself between the gunman and all the other people in the room. The second gunman panicked. He shoved the child away. She ran toward Dr. Harper, who pulled her close, and raised his gun with shaking hands. Daniel saw the fear in the man's eyes, saw his fingers starting to squeeze the trigger. He sidestepped the shot before it was even fired, body already moving based on the micro-expressions and muscle tension he'd been trained to read. The gun went off. The bullet embedded itself in the wall where Daniel had been standing a fraction of a second earlier. Daniel closed the remaining distance, disarmed the gunman with a controlled joint lock, and put him on the ground next to his friend. 2 down, 1 to go. The third gunman, watching his partner subdued in less than 30 seconds, made a choice. He dropped his weapon, put his hands up. "Don't shoot. I give up. Don't shoot." Gestured for the man to lie down and calmly said, "Security, you can open the doors now." The security team burst through the doors seconds later, followed closely by a wave of Chicago police officers. They stopped short, taking in the scene. 3 armed suspects on the ground, one still groaning from Daniel's takedown. Their weapons scattered and cleared, and Danielle Carter, trauma nurse, standing calmly in the middle of it all, already moving to check on the 7-year-old girl. "You okay, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice gentle again, the warrior completely gone. "Did he hurt you?" The child shook her head, clinging to Dr. Harper, who was staring at Daniel like she'd never seen him before. One of the police officers approached Daniel. "Sir, are you the one who subdued these Peaks?" "Yes, officer." "Can I ask what your training background is?" "Navy SEAL. Retired, 8 years active duty." Daniel said it matter-of-factly, the way someone else might say they used to be an accountant. The officer nodded slowly, looking at the 3 men on the ground and the weapons safely cleared. "That makes sense. Can you stick around for a statement?" "Of course. But first, can someone check on my patient, the little girl? She was admitted for observation after a car accident. I need to make sure this didn't cause any complications." Even after what had just happened, his first concern was patient care. The hospital administrator arrived 10 minutes later, having been called at home. He found Daniel giving his statement to police while simultaneously directing staff to check on shaken patients and restore order to the ER. Harper approached him slowly, her hands still shaking slightly from the adrenaline crash. "Daniel, why Al?" He turned to her with the same patient expression he always wore. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. I've treated you terribly. For months. I made assumptions. I was wrong. About everything." Daniel nodded. "You made assumptions because I never told you any different. But maybe that's the point. You never asked." As the police finished processing the scene and paramedics treated staff members for shock, the hospital administrator pulled Daniel aside. "Why didn't you tell us?" he asked. "Your application just said previous employment." "Various. We had no idea you were a SEAL." Daniel shrugged. "Didn't seem relevant to being a nurse. I left that life behind because I wanted to heal people instead of hurt them. The skills are useful sometimes, but they're not who I am anymore." The administrator gestured to the 3 subdued gunmen being led away in handcuffs. "Those skills just saved a lot of lives. Being in the right place at the right time saved lives," Daniel corrected. "Any one of these nurses would have done the same if they could. But they both knew that wasn't true." Later, after his shift finally ended around 6 a.m., Daniel sat in the break room with several colleagues who'd stayed to decompress. The story was already spreading through the hospital. Someone had pulled his service record with his permission. Silver Star for actions under fire in Afghanistan. Bronze Star with valor for combat rescue operations, multiple commendations, 3 deployments. Special operations. Dr. Harper sat across from him, looking exhausted and humbled. "Why nursing?" she asked. "After everything you did, everything you accomplished, why this?" Daniel thought about it for a moment. "Because I spent 8 years being the person who showed up when things were at their worst. When people were hurt, scared, dying, I was good at my job, but I was tired of only seeing people on the worst days of their lives because of violence." He paused, his eyes distant for a moment. "Now I still show up on the worst days of people's lives, but I'm healing them instead of the alternative. It feels like the right way to use what I learned." 3 days later, Chicago Memorial held a small ceremony in the hospital auditorium. The local news was there. The police chief came. So did the young girl's parents, holding their daughter, who'd made a full recovery. Daniel stood on the stage in his nurse's scrubs. He'd refused to wear anything else, while the hospital administrator presented him with the Civilian Heroism Award and the police department gave him a commendation for bravery. Dr. Harper spoke during the ceremony. She'd asked to say something publicly, and Daniel had agreed. "I've been a surgeon for 12 years, she began, her voice carrying across the room. "I pride myself on my skills, my education, my judgment, but I failed at something basic. I worked beside Danielle Carter for 2 years and never once took the time to actually know him. I made assumptions based on nothing but my own bias. I saw quiet and assumed passive. I saw humble and assumed incompetent." She looked at Daniel, who stood calmly beside her. "Daniel saved my life 3 days ago. He saved all of our lives. But more than that, he taught me something about respect and dignity and the danger of assumptions. I apologize, publicly, for how I treated you, and I hope I can be a better colleague and a better person going forward." The room applauded. Daniel accepted her apology with grace, then stepped to the microphone. "I appreciate the recognition," he said simply. "But what happened that night isn't about me being special. It's about being present, being ready. Using whatever skills you have when they're needed. Every person in this hospital does that every single day. Every nurse, every doctor, every person who shows up to help others. You're all heroes. I just had different training for a different kind of emergency." He looked out at the audience, at his colleagues, at the little girl smiling at him from her mother's arms. "We all have hidden depths. We all have stories. Maybe the lesson here is just to take time to know people, to respect them regardless of how quiet or loud they are. Everyone deserves that. 3 months after that night, Danielle Carter still worked the night shift at Chicago Memorial's ER. By choice, it's where he was needed most, he said. But things had changed, subtly but meaningfully. Staff members asked each other questions now, about backgrounds, about experiences, about the paths that had led them to medicine. The culture of assumption had begun to crack. Dr. Harper had become one of Daniel's closest colleagues. She sought his opinion on cases. She defended him when others questioned his judgment. She'd learned to see past her own ego. Daniel had also agreed to train the hospital staff in active shooter response, using his expertise to help others prepare for situations he hoped they'd never face. He taught them about staying calm under pressure, about situational awareness, about making decisions when lives hung in the balance. The 7-year-old girl, whose name was Emma, came back to visit him regularly. She'd drawn him a picture that hung in the nurse's locker room, a stick-figure nurse with a cape and the words "My Hero" in crayon. Daniel looked at that picture sometimes and felt something shift in his chest. This was why he'd become a nurse, not for recognition or glory, but for moments like this, for the kids who got to grow up, for the patients who went home, for the lives saved through care and compassion rather than combat. He'd been a warrior once, a good one, but being a healer felt like coming home. The quietest people are often the strongest, he'd learned. Not because they're hiding something, but because they've already proven what they needed to prove to themselves, to their brothers in arms, to the only people whose opinions truly mattered. The rest of the world could make whatever assumptions they wanted. Daniel knew who he was, and on the night when it mattered most, that knowledge had saved lives. He returned to his patient's clipboard in hand, a smile ready for whoever needed comfort. The warrior had become a healer. And both versions of Danielle Carter had learned the same truth. True strength doesn't need to announce itself. It just shows up when needed, does what's necessary, and goes back to work. That night, as his shift began, Daniel checked on his first patient, an elderly man with chest pain. He took the man's vitals, spoke to him gently, explo, in every procedure, and made him feel safe. No one watching would have guessed that these same hands had disarmed 3 gunmen in under a minute, and that was exactly how Daniel wanted it. Because the measure of a person isn't in their most dramatic moment. It's in how they show up every single day, for every single person, whether anyone's watching or not. Danielle Carter showed up. That's what heroes do.